Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that you're about to see is the third in a series of videos concerning the sisters in the church, the role of women in the church. This video is a part of my house church playlist, which has videos covering all sorts of ecclesiological topics based on the idea that the New Testament church was a house church. The Lord's Supper is a full meal and so forth, with all kinds of apostolic patterns which are not being followed today, but which should be followed today with lots and lots of blessings. Now, I've already talked about in the previous two videos the feminist background to this discussion, which makes it so difficult to look at the scriptures objectively, and I've also talked about ministries that are open to women. That was in the first video concerning sisters in the church. The second video, I talked about 1 Timothy 2:12 and some other arguments on why the scriptures prohibit women to be teachers and leaders in the church. Now, in this video, we are going to take up silence in the assembly. Women said women should be silent in the assembly. This is in 1 Corinthians 14:34. It's one of the most difficult passages in the scripture, but we're going to talk about it. And after that, we're going to talk about the head covering, which is probably the most difficult passage in the scripture. This ought to be fun. I hope you enjoy it. All right, let's get started here. Silence in the assembly, part number 4 of my PowerPoint. Now, there are two views on this. Well, there's a lot of views. There's more been written on this than probably about any other subject under the sun. But I'm only going to take up two views. The view that I think is the correct view, and another view which is the surface view, I'll call it, because on the surface it sounds like Paul is telling the women they should not say anything in the assembly. That's called the absolute silence view, or I'll call it that. The other view that I'm going to take up is Paul is telling the women they shouldn't judge prophecy. They should be silent as far as judging men's prophecy in particular. So let's take up that view first, the view that men should not judge prophecy. And here's our problem verse, 1 Corinthians 14:34. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. And of course, this rubs feminists raw. They just ignore it. See, it's cultural, and it's, we're not going to ignore it. We're going to deal with it. What we're going to take up first is arguments in the favor of the proposition that women should be silent when it comes to judging men's prophecies. Now, here's some arguments in favor of that view. First of all, the context. Now, let's look at the immediate context first. The verses before this problem verse deal with prophecy. 1 Corinthians 14:29 through 30 says this: 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should evaluate. Prophets, 2 or 3 prophets should speak. But if something has been revealed to another person sitting there, that means to another prophet, the first prophet should be silent. So Paul he's getting ready to talk about he is talking about prophets when he's getting ready to tell women that they should be silent and not judge prophets. Let's look at the verses after our problem verse, 1 Corinthians 14:34. The verses after say this. Here's verse 37. If anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, he should recognize that what I wrote to you is the Lord's command. So he's basically regulating prophecy in the assembly. That's what the whole chapter is about, actually, is encouraging and regulating prophecy in the assembly. And so just as soon as he tells the women to keep silent, right after that he says, if anyone thinks he is a prophet. He's still talking about prophecy. Verse 39, he says, therefore, my brothers, be eager to prophesy. He's still talking about prophecy. So right before and right after our problem verse, where Paul tells the women to keep silent in the churches, Paul is talking about prophecy. Now, let's look at the broader context. The whole chapter of 1 Corinthians 14, all of chapter 14 focuses on prophecy. And the question is why would Paul all of a sudden throw out a prohibition on women speaking unless the prohibition had something to do with prophecy? There's no context. Why would all of a sudden he say, I don't want women to speak? But he's not talking about women in the church. He's not talking about speaking in the church. He's not talking about women causing disorder in the church. He's talking about prophecy. If you'll look at 1 Corinthians 14, 1 through 5, and verses 24 through 25, those 7 verses at the very head of the chapter are talking about prophecy. Brother, now would that you prophesy. Prophesying is better than tongues in the assembly, and so forth and so on. He's talking about prophecy. So the context is a very strong argument that women should keep silent in the churches when it comes to judging men's prophecies. Why? Here's another argument in favor of this view. Women judging a man's prophecy shows disrespect for God's creation order concerning gender. Of course, that's all of what chapter 11 is about. And Paul is very concerned about, in 1 Timothy 2:12, for example, 1 Corinthians 11, and I will say right here in 1 Corinthians 14, however you interpret this, it's very clear that Paul is worried about order in the assembly and gender roles in the assembly. That's why feminists have a hard time with the Bible. They don't like the Bible because it violates their feminism. So Paul is concerned about that. He wants to show respect for God's creation. And a woman praying or prophesying in the church does not show disrespect for God's creation. But Paul says an unsilent woman is shameful. 1 Corinthians 14:35, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Now, let's look at the 2 views here. The absolute silence view says that it is shameful for a woman to say anything in church, anything at all. But I ask you, what's shameful about a woman praying or prophesying in church? There's nothing shameful about that. So, in my view, the absolute silence view is questionable right here because it's not shameful for a woman to prophesy in church. So, let's look at another argument in favor of the women should not judge men's prophecy view. Women did pray or prophesy in the church, and that's not absolute silence. If you go back to 1 Corinthians 11:5, it says, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, if you're going to believe in absolute silence, you got a big piece of meat to swallow right here. Now, this is how the absolute silence view handles this. Those advocates say that this praying and prophesying that's done by women with their heads covered is done outside the church. By the way, the covering, let's don't even think about that right now, but I'm going to try to prove at the end of this video that the covering refers to the woman's hair. So, but that's not at issue here. The point is the woman is praying or prophesying, and if you pray or prophesy, you cannot be absolutely silent. You have to make noise. So what the absolute silence people say is this praying or prophesying is done outside the church. Now, it seems to me it's kind of strange that it's all right for a woman to pray outside the church, but she's got to be totally silent in the church. I mean, what's the difference? Now, the argument that the absolute silence people use to show that, to try to prove that this praying and prophesying is done outside the church is that the immediate context, previous context, is referring to private settings, eating meat in private homes. This is the passages where Paul is dealing with the practice of eating idol meat in a home. Does it cause somebody to stumble? Who's going to judge my conscience? And all of those doubtful things there. And that's obviously not inside the church. It's eating meat. Well, that's true about the previous context, but what about the private context? Oops, I meant to say, what about the following context? All right, let's look at the response to this idea that women prayed or prophesied only outside the church. They never prayed or prophesied inside the church. First of all, why would anyone care about heads being covered in private? What's the big deal? You're sitting around eating meat or idol, which might be idol meat, and a woman gives a prophecy. Why would somebody care whether her head is covered in private or not being covered in private? I can't figure that out. But the best argument against the idea that the women are praying and prophesying only outside the church and not inside the church is that the context after 1 Corinthians 11:5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. The context after that verse is 1 Corinthians 11:6, 17, which says this: Now, in giving the following instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. You come together. I would submit to you that the most logical reading of that passage refers to praying or prophesying in the church. And praying or prophesying in the church cannot demand that a woman be silent in the church. All right, that's the don't judge men's prophecy view. That's the view that I hold. Let's look at the other view, absolute silence view. Here's some arguments in favor of that view. The prohibition sounds absolute. Paul says this: the woman should keep silent in the churches. He doesn't say the woman should keep silent in judging men's prophecies. Well, here's a response to that. Even though absolute silence advocates don't say, even they don't say that silence is absolute. They say that women can pray to themselves in the church, they can rebuke a child, they can ask for instructions. What should I do about this? What should I do about that? And they don't really mean absolute silence. What they mean is silence with regard to the good theological stuff that's going on. Prophecies, words of wisdom, words of knowledge, teaching, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. They should be silent about that. But they don't mean, the word does not mean absolutely absolute silence. Here's a better response. And here's some nearby passages to 1 Corinthians 14:34, where silence is commanded, and it sounds like absolute silence, but it obviously is not absolute silence. Here's 1 Corinthians 14:30, 4 verses previous to our controverted verse. This is what Paul says to the Corinthians: But if something has been revealed to another person sitting there, the first prophet should be silent. Well, that sounds like absolute silence, doesn't it? It's the same Greek word. It's absolute sigao, I think it is. It's the same Greek word. Does it mean absolute silence? No, it means silent with regard to giving another prophecy. Keep quiet about prophecies, which again is the context of this whole passage. Here's another verse that sounds like absolute silence. 2 verses earlier in 1 Corinthians 14:28. But if there is no interpreter, the person should keep silent in the church and speak to himself and to God. Well, does that mean the person should keep totally silent and never say anything and never speak in another tongue, never give another prophecy, never give another teaching? No, it says if there's no interpreter, it means keep silent with regard to giving a public tongue in the church. So silence doesn't always mean absolute silence. In fact, in the context, it's clear it does not mean absolute silence. Now, here's another pretty strong argument in favor of this absolute silence view. All of 1 Corinthians 14 is addressed to brothers. Not sisters, but brothers. And so here's how the argument goes. The word brothers refers to men only. Therefore, when it says men are to prophesy, men are to give words of wisdom and words of revelation and healing and all that kind of stuff, it's only the men doing it, not the women. All right, well, let's answer that. First of all, the word for brothers is sibling, actually, which includes women. And this is easy to prove. And in fact, I think most absolute silence advocates will concede this point because it's so strong. The word is adelphoi, which means sibling, brother or sister. Here's Bauer, Arndt, and Gendrick says this: the plural there of adelphoi can also mean brothers and sisters. And of course, we're talking about the plural, adelphoi, plural. It can also mean brothers and sisters. So says Bauer, Arndt, and Gendrick, the authoritative Greek lexicon that everybody uses. And then Bauer, Arndt, and Gendrick refer to Luke 21:16, and they say there is no doubt that adelphoi, brothers, there means brothers and sisters. And here's Luke 21:16 in the NIV. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters. So you can't say that just because Paul says brothers there in the English translation that it doesn't mean brothers and sisters. It doesn't. It's a generic word that means brothers and sisters. All right? Now here's another argument that the absolute silence advocates use. They say that brothers means male brothers only because of a pronoun shift from you to they. Now I need to explain this. Here's how the argument goes. All the way through 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says, brothers, you. For example, in verse 6, he says, now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues. Now, according to their theory, this brothers only refers to the male brothers. Now, male brothers only, if I come to you speaking in tongues, verse 20, male brothers only, do not be children in your thinking. Verse 26, what then, male brothers only? And then we get to verse 34b, and Paul says, but the women, they are not allowed to speak. So you have a pronoun shift from you, now brothers, you, plural, and then you go to they, the women, they. And so, therefore, the brothers can only refer to the male brothers, not the brothers and sisters, but the male brothers only, because of that they there. Now, that sounds very clever, but let me give you a response to that just by using an analogous example. Now, let's say that I'm a professor and I'm teaching a class, and this class is half men and half women. And I say to the class, students, I want you, plural, to prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I want you, both men and women, to prepare a PowerPoint presentation. Students, I want you, both men and women, to present for 20 minutes. And I'm assuming the you means both men and women. Students, I want you to include internet research, both men and women. As for the women, I want them to wear dress skirts. That's perfectly normal English. Now, you could say, students, I want you to include internet research, and the women, I want you to wear dress skirts. I could point my finger at the subclass of students, the women subclass of students, and say, all right, women, I want you, and I could address that subclass directly and say, I want you to wear dress skirts. Sure, that's possible. You could do that, but you could also be talking to the whole class as a whole, and then instead of addressing the women's subclass directly, I could be referring it to in the third person. I could say it this way. I'm talking to the whole group, men and women, and then I could refer to the women in the third person and say, the women, I want them to wear dress skirts. That's perfectly good English. It's perfectly natural English. There's nothing strained about it. Not a problem at all. So there's a pronoun shift, but I've given you an example where students refers to both men and women, and I've given you the pronoun shift. It's not a problem. All right, let me make my analogy clear as a summary. Just as I can say to a co-ed class, students, men and women, I want you to prepare a PowerPoint presentation, and students, men and women, I want you to present for 20 minutes, etc., etc. And as far as for the women students, I want them to wear dress skirts, and that makes perfectly good sense, perfectly good English. I can do the same thing with 1 Corinthians 14. I can say brothers in verse 6. I can say brothers and sisters in verse 6. If I come speaking to you in a tongue in verse 20, I can say, brothers and sisters, don't be childish in your thinking. And verse 26, I can say, how is it then, brothers and sisters, that each one of you has a psalm? And as far as the women, I want them to keep silent in the churches. That makes perfectly good sense. It makes perfectly good English. There is nothing wrong with that. I do not believe that Paul meant for the women to be absolutely silent in the churches. All right, so let's go to the last contentious issue, the problem of head covering, which is probably the most difficult passage in the New Testament, if you ask me. Now, I've wrestled with this for years, and I finally came across a view by Dr. Svendsen. Actually, I had this view in my possession for about 10 years, and I read it, and I wasn't convinced by it, but I didn't look at it carefully. And I went through it recently, just very, very carefully, and I think that he's right on the money. I think he's got it. He went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, the same seminary I went to, and I've talked to him on the phone, and I've read his book. I've got his article on this, and he does, of course, he's going to do a much better view, a much better defense of this view than I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the skinny version of it. But as we give it here, I think you'll see it makes a lot of sense. Now, let me give you a summary statement of the view. Man as the head of a woman is a universal principle that all agreed upon. Paul and a group of people in the Corinthian church who were contending with Paul. We'll call them the contentious ones, because Paul says if anybody wants to be contentious about this, and by the way, this is in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through, 16, 17, somewhere around there, first part of 1 Corinthians 11. Now, Paul and the people that he's contending with both agree on a universal principle that man is the head of the woman, that woman should submit to man's godly leadership, and so forth. They also agree. They agree that God is the head of Christ. That even nature tells you that head covering is good. The angels will be upset if we don't show this submission with a head covering. They agree on all that. They agree on the principle that that a woman's head ought to be covered as a sign of submission. Not a problem. But what they disagree on is how to show the principle of male headship and women's submission. How do you show that? Now, these contentious people, according to Dr. Svendsen's view, these contentious people insisted on cloth head coverings for women to show that submission. And Paul says, no, you don't need to have cloth head coverings to show that submission because women have long hair and that will do just fine for the covering. See this long hair? That's plenty covering. She doesn't need a cloth covering up there. That's the general view, that what I call the Svendsen view. And I'm going to go through it here and try to explain it to you. Now, here's an expanded statement of Dr. Eric Svendsen's view. From 1 Corinthians 11:2 to 11:14, Paul is advocating a covering. And this covering is he uses a general Greek verb to show that covering, katakalupto. It specifies no particular cover for the woman's head, no particular covering, no particular type of covering. It's just a covering in general. Now, here's some examples of where Paul says this in verses 5 through 7. In 1 Corinthians 11, he says this, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered in general, not uncovered with a cloth covering, but just uncovered in general, dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. So if a woman's head is not covered generally with some kind of head covering, not necessarily a cloth head covering, not particularly a cloth head covering, but if a woman's head is not covered in general with something, her hair should be cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or head shaved, she should be covered with some kind of head covering, not necessarily a cloth head covering, because the word is katakalupto, which does not mean cloth head covering. It just means some kind of head covering. A man, verse 7, a man, in fact, should not cover his head. Generally, he should not have his head covered. Paul is not saying a man should not cover his head with cloth. He's just saying he should not have some kind of a head covering because that would not show that would show he was in submission and not taking his leadership role. All right, so now as we move on with the argument, with the same idea that katakalupto is specifying no type of particular covering, 1 Corinthians 11:13 says this, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? In other words, to pray with her head without some kind of a cover. Paul does not mean, the Greek word does not mean to pray with God with her head uncovered with a cloth head covering, because katakalupto does not mean cloth head covering. All right, now we get to 1 Corinthians 11:15. Now Paul switches the Greek for covering, and this is completely hidden in the English. You can't see it. Now he uses a specific Greek word for cloth covering, and that word is parabolion. 1 Corinthians 11:15. For her hair is given to her as a cloth covering. And I say cloth covering because that's the word parabolion. Cloth covering. Her hair is given to her as a cloth covering. Now, as is better translated as instead of. It's the Greek anti, instead of. Her hair is given to her instead of a cloth covering. In other words, she doesn't need a cloth covering. The hair will do just fine. So he's trying to say, quit arguing with me, contentious ones, about saying that women need a cloth covering. I agree with you, they need a covering, but they've got a covering. They have her hair, which has been given to her instead of a cloth covering. Going on to the next verse 11:16. 1 Corinthians 11:16. Paul says this, but if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. And immediately we run into a problem, because it sounds like Paul is saying we have no other custom except to require cloth head coverings, because he just referred to cloth head coverings. Now, this would be a strong argument for Christian women having to wear head coverings, and you run into people like this all the time who believe that. I remember in the African church I went down years ago, 20, 25 years ago, and all the women in the churches down there wore cloth head coverings. And one of them particularly asked me about this. She says, why do you in the Western church, women don't wear head coverings? Paul said to wear head coverings, and I had no answer for her. Actually, she didn't ask me. She asked the head of our mission group, who later became the president of a Bible college, and he had no answer for her either. And I remember thinking, one of these days I'm not going to be embarrassed by a question like this, and I think I can answer it now. But this is a problem here. We have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. This is referring to the practice of wearing cloth head coverings. We have no other custom but to wear cloth head coverings. It sounds like the ladies in Africa were right, as well as the Amish and the Anabaptists and other sundry Christians who believe that the cloth head covering is necessary for women to wear today. Now, this translation does make it seem that Paul wants every church woman to have a cloth covering. But I will submit to you that this is a bad translation, no other custom. Now, usually when you get into bad translation arguments, people start thinking, oh, you're in a cult, you're taking the Greek and twisting it and all. No, this is a slam dunk, folks. This is an amazing thing when you see this. For one reason that is such an amazing issue here is that you have some heavy hitters translating this verse as no other. You got the Holman Christian Study Bible, which I respect. You got the NIV, the most popular English translation in the world. You got the NASB. And for years I was trying to figure it out using the NIV and the NASB. These were the two versions I used. And this made no sense to me. We have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. I just couldn't believe that Paul wanted all the women to wear a cloth head covering because of other reasons that seemed to contradict other things in the passage, which I'm not going to get into. But it just didn't make sense to me. Well, it was so nice to read Dr. Svendsen's article, and I realized that, first of all, the KJV translates it as, we have no such custom. And the English Study Bible, English Standard Version, agrees with that. So now, if we read it this way, if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no such custom. No such custom of having cloth head coverings in our churches. And remember, in verse 2, Paul says, I want all the churches to obey my apostolic tradition here. And what is that apostolic tradition? We have no such custom of requiring the women to wear head coverings, you contentious people, so lay off. Now, who's right? The King James or the ESV saying we have no such custom, or the NIV, the NASB, and the Holman Christian Study Bible saying that we have no other custom but to require head coverings? Well, the Greek word in issue here is toiutos. It's translated other only here and nowhere else in the New American Standard Bible and the Holman Christian Study Bible. Over 50 times, let me repeat that, over 50 times in those two translations, the word is translated as something else, most of the time as such, but not other. And if you look at the King James never translates it as other. Over 60 times, according to the Strong's Concordance, the King James translates it as something else, usually such. Thayer's has only one definition for the word. Other does not even show up in the lexicon. It's such. Folks, it means such. So Paul is saying here, we have no such custom of requiring a parabolaion, a cloth head covering. We have no such custom for that. We do expect the women to be covered to show the principle of feminine submission. We do want them to be covered, but don't worry about it, contentious ones. They've got their long hair. God showed them naturally. The long hair shows the submission. Now, I think that's a pretty good argument. But we need to deal with the cultural relativists, most of whom are feminists, but there are other people who are not feminist, who say that this is just a practice that only involved Corinthian culture, and for some reason or another, culturally, the women should have their head covered with a cloth head covering. But since we are not in the Corinthian culture, therefore that requirement for Christian women today to have a head covering doesn't apply. Folks, that's not going to fly. This has nothing to do with culture. I'm going to give you some scriptures to show that this is not a cultural thing. 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. I mean, the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son, is that cultural? I will say here that there's a big controversy these days in theological circles over whether this submission of Christ to God was only in his incarnate state or whether it was eternally in the Trinity. I'm not going to get into that, but whatever the right answer to that deep theological question is, obviously the relationship between God the Father and God the Son has nothing to do with Corinthian culture. Likewise, the man is head of the woman. That's all men, all women. That doesn't have anything to do with Corinthian men and Corinthian women. 1 Corinthians 11:8-9. Right in the middle of our head covering argument, Paul says this, for man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. That's for all men and all women, not just Corinthian men and Corinthian women. And man was not created for woman, but woman for man. This is a creation issue. This is going back to the Garden of Eden. This is not going back to Corinth. 1 Corinthians 11:10. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, by the way, that's a much controverted verse, and I'm not going to get into it. The point of whatever Paul meant here is that it was because of the angels, and angels have nothing to do with Corinthian culture. It's because of something that's angels who've been created forever. Let me just give you a hint that what could be here. Nobody knows. It could be that angels are very sensitive about lack of submission because a third of their compadres showed a complete lack of submission to God, rebelled against God, and became demons. Pretty serious business. They're not happy about that, and so they don't like anything that smacks of not going along with God's created order. And so when they see something in the assembly that shows that women are not being submissive, they get upset about it. I think that's a pretty good stab at it, but nobody really knows. But again, that's not my main point. The point is angels has nothing to do with Corinthian culture. And last, another verse in our passage here, 1 Corinthians 11:12 says, for just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. That has nothing to do with Corinthian culture. So forget the cultural relativist argument. It's nonsense. It's totally ridiculous. This is a universal principle that Paul is talking about. The universal principle is that men lead, women submit in general, and we don't need a head covering to show that woman's long hair shows it for us. All right, thank you very much. Right here you can see a bunch of Christian sisters here. The crown of God's creation. Up with women and to Gehenna with feminism. I hope you enjoyed this.